Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I got a very special guest. He's a senior fellow of the Dirk von Mises Institute, Walter Block, also the author of Defending the Undefendable and other works. He's also known for his work for privatization of the roads, and he contributed a lot to the libertarian school of thought, specifically the anarcho-capitalist school of thought. You want to introduce yourself, Dr. Block?
Yes, that's a good introduction. I'm a professor at Loyola University. I teach economics here, and I have a PhD from Columbia.
Hmm. Okay. How do you discover Austrian economics, Dr. Block?
Well, I discovered it from Murray Rothbard. It was an interesting experience. Larry Moss was in my class. We were at Columbia University together, and he kept saying, "You got to meet this guy, Murray Rothbard. He's an anarchist." And I said, "Who wants to meet an anarchist?" I was sort of a Randian at the time. And then finally, he and his roommate Jerry Wallows ganged up on me. I remember on the street near Columbia, and I finally agreed to meet Murray. And I was amazed and astounded and I don't know, edified by meeting him. He is the person who changed my life. And I first got into libertarianism with him, not Austrian economics. And I was a sort of a limited government libertarian, and he converted me to anarchism in about 5 minutes. He used the arguments that I was then comfortable with that I got from Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, like why do we have pretty good shoes and pretty good shirts and pretty good turnips? Because, well, people don't do a good job, they lose money, and they eventually have to leave and do something else that they're better at. And that's why the market is pretty good. Not perfect, human element. We're not perfect, but very good. And Murray said, well, why can't that apply to government functions like armies, courts, police, what have you? And I saw it like the light bulb lit above my head, and I saw it, and I was an anarcho-capitalist libertarian. The Austrianism took quite a bit longer, maybe a year or two. I had to read Man, Economy, and State. I had to read Human Action. And finally, it sunk in. So my adherence to Austrianism was a long, slow process. My adherence to libertarianism was much, much quicker.
Hmm. Okay. Um, and, um, and so since then, you wrote some rather interesting critiques of the neoclassical school and the Friedmanite monetarism. You want to explain them quickly here?
Yes, I'm not a mainstream economist. I'm an Austrian economist. And I suppose one way to explain this is to talk about some of the differences between the two. One of the differences, we're both monetarists in the sense that we believe that the reason we have inflation is either because of increase in the money supply, or that the very definition of inflation is an increase in the money stock. Where we diverge is the mainstream Milton Friedman type mainstream macroeconomists see that about that's the only effect of increasing money supply. Whereas we Austrians agree with them, but we go a little further and we say not only does it increase inflation, but also causes the business cycle. Because when you increase the stock of money, it lowers the rate of interest. And when the rate of interest is lowered, it's a signal to entrepreneurs to invest in longer term projects, which are not really justified based on the saving and consumption decisions of the populace. So there's always a tension between the mal signal that the government is giving out with its central bank and what the people are wanting. It's as if we wanted peas and carrots equally. We wanted an equal number of peas and carrots. And the government kept subsidizing peas, and the market produced more peas. And we don't want that many peas. We want an equal number of peas and carrots. And now we got 9/10 peas and 1/10 carrots, and we've got a shortage of carrots and a surplus of peas compared to what we want. And only instead of peas and carrots, it's long-term and short-term investments and consumer goods, which creates the business cycle. Uh, Another difference between the Austrians and the mainstream is we believe in apodictic law. there are certain laws in economics, not just hypotheses, not just empirical generalizations, but absolute laws. And the mainstream does not believe in that. And not only don't they believe in that, they see it as an empirical science, but they think that anyone that takes the view that we take is sort of a cultist or a religious fanatic or something like that. Let me give you an example.
I seen your debate with Brian Kaplan.
Oh, yes. Well, I debated Bryan Kaplan on this very issue, and that's certainly true. Uh, uh, the example I gave with him is I said, Brian, you bought your shoes for $20. And from that, I deduced that you valued the shoes more than $20 ex ante at the time you bought them, and that the shoe seller valued the shoes at less than $20. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sold it to you. And therefore, you both gained in the ex ante sense. And you don't have to test this. If you understand the English language, you understand this is necessarily true, and not only necessarily true, but it tells us about the real world. Whereas for the mainstream people, they're logical positivists, and they believe that if something is absolutely true, then it's a tautology and it tells us nothing about the world. On the other hand, if it tells us something about the real world, then it can't be absolutely true. It has to be testable, falsifiable. So we Austrians diverge from our mainstream brethren in this regard as well.
Mm. So, so you want to expand a bit further on praxeology, Dr. Block?
Well,
Um,
that's what praxeology is. Praxeology is a synonym for Austrian economics. It's the praxeological method. Namely, you start with premises. You start with major premises, and Mises's major premise was man acts. And one of the reasons it's axiomatic is that if you try to deny that man acts, you're acting. So you sort of like can't get away from it. And then there are implications of the fact that man acts. He's acting purposeful. He's acting so as to make the world a better place in the future than it otherwise would have been had he not acted. And you get all sorts of implications of this. And we deduce this to things like the minimum wage and rent control and free trade and just about everything in economics. Well, not everything, because there are empirical issues. For example, we know that if the price of bananas falls by 10%, other things equal, people will buy more bananas, downward sloping demand curves. But we don't know by how much. So if you're interested in finding out how many fewer bananas will be purchased at a 10% higher price, well, then that's an empirical issue. And we join our cousins in the mainstream economic view and say, well, that has to be a testable hypothesis and it has to be falsifiable. And here we're empirical scientists. But we also say that there are economic laws as well. Another one would be a minimum wage law. The minimum wage law is $7.50, I think, something like that, maybe $7.25, I'm not sure. And we say that the effect of this will be to unemploy all people whose productivity is less than $7.50. So, for example, suppose my productivity is $4 an hour, and you are thinking of hiring me. And you have to pay me $7.50, but I'm only worth $4. So if you hire me, you're going to lose $3.50 an hour, which means you're not going to hire me, or if you hire me, you're going to go broke compared to other people who don't do this. So we say that the minimum wage law is a praxeological law. It's a necessary law. It doesn't have to be tested. It can be illustrated, but it doesn't have to be tested. And if you try to illustrate it and fail, that means that your illustration was wrong, not that the economic law was wrong.
hey, well, was there any thoughts on the disagreement that Hayek has with Mises a priori, Miesi and praxeology?
Yes, Hayek was a follower of Mises, one of his chief lieutenants, one of his most famous followers, one of his most famous students. I don't think he was ever a formal student in the sense that he took classes from Mises, but he was certainly, look, I was never a formal student of Murray Rothbard, but he's my mentor, my guru, my friend. And I think a similar relationship existed between Mises and Hayek. And Hayek certainly agreed with Mises on the business cycle theory, but he didn't agree with praxeology. He was sort of a mainstream economist on that. So he was sort of a semi-demi, quasi-Austrian on that issue. But on issues, say, the business cycle, he was a magnificent Austrian economist.
Hmm. So, do you know why Hayek chose to disagree with Mises on his apriorism or I can't say that word.
No, you said it right. A priorism. I don't know why. I guess it didn't make sense to him. Look, when I first heard this, I rejected it. It took me 2 years. I think 1 year, 3 years. Who remembers? It was a while ago. This was in 1965, 1966. I think before you were born. And I'm sure it's before you were born. And it took me quite a while because I was raised under Gary Becker's tutelage. He was my dissertation advisor at Columbia. And all through my undergraduate philosophy years as a logical positivist, namely that there's no such thing as a synthetic a priori, namely a statement that is absolutely necessarily true, undeniable, and tells us about the real world. And when I first heard this, I rejected it. It
Mhm.
was only through, I don't know, a process of osmosis or something, I'm not sure, that I finally got to see the truth of it. Hayek never did. But, Murray Rothbard had a Rothbard's law. And the Rothbard's law is that people specialize in what they're horrible in. And it doesn't always work. It worked for Milton Friedman. He was really good on minimum wage and free trade and rent control and a whole bunch of other things, but he hardly talked about it. What he talked about mostly was school vouchers and monetarism, where he was really bad. So Milton Friedman adheres to the Rothbard rule, namely that people specialize in what they're bad at. But Hayek did not. Hayek was an exception to the Rothbard rule. Hayek specialized in business cycles and economics of information, where he was very good. Another violation of this is Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, both black economists, both really magnificent in terms of discrimination, racial and sexual discrimination, all sorts of stuff like that. They're sometimes called Oreo cookies because somehow if you're black, you have to be a commie socialist, and they're not commie socialists, that's for sure. So therefore, they're inauthentically black, or they're Oreo cookies, white on the inside. But they also violate the Rothbard rule because they specialized in what they were really good at, namely discrimination and labor markets and minimum wages and things like that. And they didn't specialize in the things that they were bad at. And in my view, they were very bad on foreign policy. They're both militarists, imperialists, and they're also mainstream economists. So, but they didn't specialize in that. So that was a violation of the Rothbard rule. But to get back to Hayek, Hayek did not violate that. Rather, Hayek did violate that. He specialized in stuff where he was really good at.
Just get into your more politics. You Rothbard and Hopper both criticize Hayek's view on coercion.
I'm sorry, I can't. I can't hear you. Could you say that again?
Um, Rothbard and Hoppe both criticized Hayek on coercion and his view on the state. Well, Hayek did advocate for a very meaningless state, but giving they both criticize him because he um I forgot what that criticism was.
No, no, you're quite right. Rothbard and Hans Hoppe and me also all criticized Hayek because he was a statist. He believed in a role for the state, and not just a minimal state like Ayn Rand or Robert Nozick, but a more intrusive state. And so I like to think of Hayek as an excellent Austrian economist, but not that good of a libertarian. He was sort of a watered down libertarian, I don't know, a moderate libertarian. He believed not only in armies, courts, and police that Ayn Rand believed in and Robert Nozick, but he also believed in a ton of other stuff. I don't know, welfare and I don't know, public schooling and all sorts of other stuff. So, I mean, Hayek and Friedman were both free enterprises, but they allowed for market failure and an awful lot of government intervention. So I see Hayek as a economist, but I don't know, a C plus libertarian.
C plus libertarian. That's kind of funny. Um, just do you have any? You also wrote a rather polemical attack on the road to serfdom, basically saying that he gave away. He wasn't really principled enough for you guys. That he conceded to the socialists to a certain extent, if my memory is correct.
Oh, your memory is very correct. That's absolutely correct. I accused Hayek of giving away the store. That Hayek made all sorts of compromises with a bunch of socialists, and I regretted that, and I disagreed with Hayek. And then I got into a little debate with Milton Friedman, who defended Hayek, and Milton Friedman and I went back and forth, 4 or 5 letters, and at the end, he said that I was I forget what he called me, an extremist or something like that. And my last parting shot at him was, well, if I'm an extremist, how about your son, David? David Friedman was also an anarchist. So is David a radical maniac like you're calling me? And he never responded to that.
Oh, didn't you call Friedman a road socialist too?
Oh, yes, yes. Friedman was a road socialist. One of my books is Why We Should Privatize Highways, Roads and Highways and Streets. And Friedman disagreed with that. So I called him a road socialist, and he didn't much agree. He was a little miffed at me for saying that, because he doesn't see himself as a socialist. But, what is it? If it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, maybe it is a duck. Well, look, Friedman was not a socialist on every issue. I didn't say he was a socialist, plain socialist. I said he was a road socialist, namely he supported government roads. Most people are road socialists. Very few people think we can have privatized highways, streets, and roads.
Someone's asking a rather interesting question in the live chats. What's your view on Hayek's view on coordination plan versus Mises' view on price coordination with Salerno stresses and the whole he's basically asking about where Mises and Hayek disagreed on regarding the business cycle. They have I think Mises was a endogenous theorist, while Hayek was exogenous, if I'm saying those words correctly.
Exogenous.
Exogenous.
Exogenous versus endogenous. Yes, I'm with Joe Salerno on this. Joe Salerno started a whole series of articles, and I contributed 1 or 2 to it. And it's called the dehomogenization process, or the dehomogenization something. I forget what Joe called it. I remember the word dehomogenization, and the idea was that are Mises and Hayek exactly the same on everything? And Joe was saying no. And he was pointing out areas where Mises and Hayek diverged. Well, look, there's nothing wrong with that. We're all imperfect human beings. None of us has all the answers to everything. Look, I disagree with Murray Rothbard on some things. So someday maybe you or some young person could write the dehomogenization of Rothbard and Bloch. Look, I revere Murray, and I think he's the second best economist ever to have lived. Mises was first, and also the best libertarian who ever lived. But yet I disagree with Murray on libertarianism and on Austrian economics. So there's nothing wrong with people disagreeing with each other. We're not a Randian cult. In the Ayn Rand's cult, if you disagreed with her on anything, they kicked you out of the cult. We're not like that at all. We have divergences. So yes, Mises and Hayek also had a divergence, and Mises on the planning issue saw it just as a matter of the fact that the central planner has no prices, and if he has no prices, he can't plan whatsoever. Whereas the Hayek analysis of central planning, I think was also good, but not excellent, not exquisite like Mises's was. And Hayek was saying, well, it's really an informational issue. And I agree with that. I think Hayek made a positive contribution with his work on information. But I think that Mises's view was much more deeply seated, because suppose we stipulated a supercomputer that gave all the information. Now Hayek would be satisfied, but Mises would still not really be satisfied. And I think Mises was correct and Hayek incorrect. But so in my view, it's that Hayek fastened onto something important but not crucial, whereas Mises was fastening on and focusing on something very crucial.
Do you have any opinion on Israel Kerzner attempt to emphasize Mises and Hayek?
I didn't catch the last part. The first part was, do I have any opinion on Israel Kerzner? What was the Hayek part?
On the Mises Hayek homogenization thing debate.
The Mises Hayek homogenization issue.
Yeah,
Well, I think that Israel was more on the Mises side here. Israel, every time they award the Nobel Prize for Economics, I think that maybe one of these days they'll give it to Israel Kerzner, because he is right now the eminence gris, the grand old man of Austrian economics, the last of the generation before me. Mises and Rothbard are all passed away, but Israel Kerzner is very elderly, but he's still around. He hasn't really been involved that much in Austrian economics recently. He's got more involved in Talmudic Jewish studies, but I think he's made very, very important contributions, mainly on entrepreneurship. In most economic textbooks, mainstream economic textbooks, what they talk about are three things: land, labor, and capital. They hardly ever talk about entrepreneurship. A lot of times, there's not even a chapter on entrepreneurship. A lot of times, if you look in the index, they don't even mention entrepreneurship. Whereas Israel Kerzner has put entrepreneurship front and center, and top and bottom and every which way. Israel Kerzner has done yeoman work, mentioning the importance of the entrepreneur. And I think he's made a wonderful contribution. In a sense, he's a little Hayekian with the knowledge business of entrepreneurship, but I think he's a very important economist, and I think he richly deserves the Nobel Prize, a lot more than a lot of the people that have already gotten it.
Mm-hmm. Just my main question was about him. Like, what is your view on his debate? Like, he took he tried to homogenize Mises. Like that was sort of like his main side of the debate, where Salerno disagrees with him there.
I'm sorry, your voice faded in and out, and I couldn't really hear you. And I want to do justice to your question, so you're going to have to repeat it.
Okay. So, Israel Kerzner tried to homogenize Mises and Hayek, and Salerno disagreed with him on that. What's your personal view on it?
I now got your question. I would rephrase your question or edit your question and say that Joe Salerno started the dehomogenization process, and Israel Kerzner disagreed. Israel Kerzner said that Joe was actually, he was a little harsh on Joe. He said he was a verbal terrorist or something like that, which I thought was a little weird. I'm with Joe Salerno on this one. I'm pretty much with Joe Salerno on everything. Well, not everything. I'm sure he and I disagree too. But on this issue of the dehomogenization of Mises and Hayek, Joe took the position, yes, there is a dehomogenization, there is a difference, whereas Israel Kerzner was accentuating the similarities. And look, there are similarities, for goodness sakes. I mean, Mises was Hayek's teacher, in effect, although never a formal teacher. So there's plenty of homogenization. There's plenty of agreement between the two. And Joe Salerno wouldn't disagree with that. He would say, yeah, of course there's similarities, but there are also differences. And Israel Kerzner, I think, was wrong in saying, no, there are virtually no differences. I think Joe Salerno was correct.
Okay. Let's see. Let's talk about one of your books, Defending the Undefendable, the most famous and probably the most controversial books out of your academic career. You want to explain the story behind that?
Okay, sure. By the way, there are now two Defending the Undefendables. There's Defending the Undefendable and Defending the Undefendable 2. And I'm right now working on Defending the Undefendable 3 with a new cast of characters each time. And the essence of the book is, look, we're libertarians. We libertarians believe that you can do anything you damn well please as long as you keep your mitts off of other people and their property. And yet there are certain activities that adhere to the non-aggression principle, that adhere to libertarianism, and yet are either illegal or hated by everybody. And what Defending the Undefendable were the people who are cordially hated by pretty much everyone, and also their activities are prohibited by law. Let me give you a few examples of this. Let me get that book out. Here we go. Okay, the first one in Defending the Undefendable is the prostitute. Now, look, I'm not in favor of prostitution. I don't think prostitution is good. I don't patronize prostitutes. I have a daughter. I wouldn't want her to be a prostitute. But the question is, should they go to jail? And in many jurisdictions, prostitutes are put in jail. And as long as the prostitute sticks to consenting adults, I mean, look, if a prostitute goes to bed with an underage person, well, then yes, they should go to jail for that, but not for prostitution between consenting adults. So what I did in this book is I defended prostitution, not prostitution per se, which I actually oppose, but the legalization of it. And also, people diminish prostitutes. They think, it's horrible and awful. And, I don't see that as horrible and awful as long as it's between consenting adults. So I defended the prostitute. I also defended the pimp. The third one was the male chauvinist pig. I defended the male chauvinist pig. People should be free to be chauvinist pigs, not to be rapists. That would be horrible. But to diminish women, to demean women, to look down upon women. Look, it's a free country. Well, it should be a free country. The second group in defending the undefendable is medical, and I have the drug addict and the drug pusher. Look, I don't use heroin. I don't use cocaine. I don't use even marijuana. I don't even smoke cigarettes or drink booze. I'm sort of a teetotaler. That's my personal taste, but which is really irrelevant. The question is, suppose you want to buy heroin and you're an adult and you want to stick something in your body, which I regard as really harmful. Should you go to jail for that? Should the guy who sells you the drugs go to jail for that? Should we deprecate people who do that? No, it's just a different taste. Look, at one time, we had prohibition of alcohol, and a lot of young Italian men were shooting each other over alcohol. Now we have prohibition of drugs, and a lot of young black men are shooting each other over drug turf. And I think, and we used to have bathtub gin, and people would die from impure alcohol, and now we have people dying from impure heroin. And I think what we should do is treat heroin or cocaine or whatever roughly the same way we treat alcohol, namely nothing for kids. Kids are always a separate problem, but adults should be able to do that. Then in defending the undefendable, I have about 30 chapters. I don't want to go through all of them. It'll take forever, but let me just go through one or two more chapters. The next one is the blackmailer. This is under free speech. And what I do is I distinguish blackmail from extortion. Now, blackmail and extortion are similar in some ways. In each case, there's a threat accompanied by a demand for money or sexual services or something, a threat and a demand for something. The difference between extortion and blackmail is that what the extortionist threatens is to violate the non-aggression principle. He threatens that if you don't give me money, I'm going to shoot you, or if you don't give me money, I'm going to kidnap your children. That's very bad, and I think extortionists should go to jail. But what does the blackmailer threaten? The blackmailer threatens to become a gossip. The blackmailer threatens you, hey, I saw you in bed with some lady that you're not supposed to be in bed with because you're married and so is she, and I'm going to tell everybody unless you give me money. Namely, the blackmailer threatens to become a gossip. Well, look, gossip is legal, so threatening something legal shouldn't be illegal either. So I defend blackmail. Let me just give you one last example of defending the undefendable, and that's the person who yells fire in a crowded theater. I think it was Justice Holmes, one of those Supreme Court guys, who said, well, we favor free speech, but free speech is not absolute because you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And my analysis of that was, well, why can't you yell fire in a crowded theater? Has it got anything to do with free speech? And my answer is no. It's got to do with the contract violation. Namely, the reason you should shut up and watch the movie, unless there's a fire, in which case you can yell fire, is because of a contract. Namely, you bought a ticket, and the implicit or explicit contract is sit there and shut up, or applaud maybe, or... Are we okay here? I'm hearing all sorts of noise. Are we okay? Can you still hear me? Hello? Yoo-hoo!
Clear, sorry.
Are we okay?
Yeah, I just switched mics. That's it.
Oh, okay. Good. I heard a whole bunch of noise. So let me get back to it. So the reason you shouldn't be yelling fire is because it's a contract violation. It's got nothing to do with free speech. By the way, I'm not a free speech absolutist. There are certain speech statements that should be illegal, and those are threats. So, for example, if I say, give me money or I'll shoot you, and I was serious. I'm not serious. Obviously, I'm not threatening you to give me money or I'll shoot you. But if I was serious, especially if I were pointing a gun at you, I need not have done anything physically violent. I just made a threat, and that should be illegal. But apart from threats, all other free speech goes, including incitement and blackmail and just about anything else.
Hmm. Yeah. Let's see. Um, blackmail. Oh, right. You wrote a book about legalizing blackmail.
Yes.
Eh. And you're actually, I was watching a lecture about that on the Mrs. YouTube website thing. You're basically saying that actually you just stated your main argument for blackmail right here, so I don't really.
Yes. What happened is I had a short paper in Defending the Undefendable, or maybe 4 or 5 pages. And then what I did is I wrote a whole book about it. And the whole book, the impetus for that was there was this seminar at one of the very famous law schools. And they had a whole bunch, maybe 20 people writing about blackmail. And they all agreed that blackmail should be prohibited, and they only diverged because some said, well, it should be prohibited deontologically, namely because it's wrong, it's a violation of rights, and the others said, well, no, it should be prohibited because it's harmful, it's non-pragmatic, it's non-utilitarian. And I'm the only one that said no, blackmail should be legal. So what I did is I went over each and every argument, and some of the people were very famous legal professors, law professors, and I said, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So I have, in addition to 3 or 4 pages in Defending the Undefendable, I also have an entire book, I don't know, maybe 200 or 300 pages, criticizing all those who said blackmail should be prohibited by law, and I'm taking the view that they're wrong and that it should be legalized.
Okay. You earlier you mentioned David Friedman, and you consider yourself to be launch, the
Deontological.
deontological libertarian, while David Friedman is more of a consequentialist and utilitarian. What's your main disagreement with? How will you argue against David Friedman, consequentialism and utilitarianism?
Well, it's interesting. I do this. I mean, David Friedman and I are both anarcho-capitalist libertarians, so we're homogeneous in many ways. And an outsider hearing him speak and hearing me speak would see no difference between us. It's only the cognoscenti, such as you and I, who would see a difference between us. Murray Rothbard once wrote a brilliant essay. Now, that's silly. Every essay Murray ever wrote was brilliant, but one of his brilliant essays was on David Friedman. And Murray said, I think the title of it was something like, Do You Hate the State? And he criticized David Friedman for not hating the state. And in David Friedman's view, the government is sort of part of the market almost, only it's inefficient and it's bumbling and it's not profit and loss oriented. And, we should really have private enterprise. Whereas the view that Murray and I have is this, yes, all that is correct. The state is bumbling, the state is inefficient. However, the state is also evil. And the word evil, I don't think ever crossed David's lips in this regard, or crossed through his fingers onto his keyboard. He doesn't see it as evil. And the reason I and Murray and Hans Hoppe and other anarcho-capitalists see it as not only inefficient but evil is because they violate the non-aggression principle. They tax us. And, we have a word for taking money from people against their will who haven't agreed to pay for it. And that's called theft. So the government is a vast robber gang. And there's none of this in David Friedman. You can read everything he's ever written, and you'll not find anything like that. I also have an explicit attack on him. I think it was his chapter 43 in Machinery of Freedom, and I wrote a blistering attack on that because he's sort of a mainstream person. He believes in market failures and this and that and the other. And I sent it to him, and I asked him to reply, and then we can have a little debate through the literature. And unfortunately, unhappily, he has not yet seen fit to agree to do what I asked him to do.
Hmm. Um, do you? do you have any response to David Friedman criticisms of the non-aggression axiom? Because he has some in the machinery of freedom.
Yes, he has a whole bunch, and that was this article of mine. Well, let me give you one of them. And I'm not sure if this was in David's or Milton. And one of the reasons Milton rejected the non-aggression principle, and I think David would go along with his dad on this, is look, suppose I saw you personally, right at the edge of a bridge, and you were about to jump into your death. Do you know what I would do? I would grab you. I would grab you. And that's assault and battery. And I would say to you, hey, what you doing? What's up? What's up? And if you said something like, look, I have late stage cancer, and I'm in excruciating pain all the time, and the morphine no longer works, and I'd rather die than live this horrible life, I'd let you go. But I'd be guilty of a crime because for 5 minutes I kept you from doing what you wanted to do, and I would be a criminal. On the other hand, if you said, well, your girlfriend left you, or you failed the midterm, or some other stupid reason for committing suicide, you know what I would do to you? I would, if I had the power, if I were bigger and stronger than you, or whatever it was, and if I had friends and I'd kidnap you. And I would put you in a room, and I would try to deprogram you and say, look, your girlfriend left you. There are plenty of other girls. You got a bad mark in the midterm. Well, there's the final. I would try to save your life. And I would be guilty of kidnapping, and I would be a criminal. And you see, what the Friedmans are saying is, what I'm doing is a decent thing. Any decent person would do what I would just do to you, namely try to save your life, unless you're in excruciating pain. I think that they would agree with me on that too, although I'm not sure. But I think that's reasonable. If you're in excruciating pain, I'm not going to stop you from suicide. But for any other stupid reason, girlfriends and exams, or you lost your job, or God knows what, or you're in gambling debt, and I don't know. I would try to save your life. But the point, see, so what the Friedmans are saying is decency is against the non-aggression principle. And therefore, we have to reject the non-aggression principle. And what I would say is, no, no, no. We don't reject the non-aggression principle. What we do is we consider me a criminal. And hopefully the court would give me a slap on the wrist, because the reason I'm kidnapping you is not for nefarious purposes. I'm kidnapping you for quote unquote good purposes, but still I'm kidnapping you. So I'm a criminal. Look, suppose you're standing right in front of a bus, and the bus is about to hit you, and I shove you out of the way of the bus, and I break your ribs. Well, maybe I'm a criminal, but what the heck? I should get a medal. And so the non-aggression principle has to be interpreted, how shall I say it, sympathetically. And it has to be defended. And the Friedmans don't defend it. They reject it. So that would be where I disagree with both of them.
Okay, I got another question from the live chat. What's the relationship between praxeology and libertarian free will? Hoodesman seems to place a high importance in the libertarian free will since it's taken that both praxeology and economics are sciences of free action.
Well, I'm a free willer. I believe that people have free will. I believe that we're not determined. I mean, we're determined in some ways. Goodness knows. I mean, biologically, we're determined. Which look, right now I'm sitting at my desk, and I've got my hands folded, and I'm thinking of scratching my nose, and I can either scratch my nose with my right hand or my left hand. And I think I'm perfectly free to scratch my nose with my left hand or my right hand. On the other hand, I'm a straight white male, so I've got certain predilections. I find women attractive, and I think that's biological. I don't think it's free will. I have the free will to do something about it or not to do something about it. So I'm not saying that everything is free will. Look, if you hit my knee in a certain way with a rubber hammer, the knee is going to, move because of reflexes and stuff like that. So we're not totally free. But on the other hand, we do have economic freedom. We can choose to, be good guys or bad guys. We can choose to be criminals or honest people. We can choose to save people who are trying to commit suicide or not to save them and just, ride by. So I believe in free will. I think praxeology is very congruent with free will, because praxeology says man acts purposefully, which means he has some control over what he's doing. So that would be the relationship I see between the two.
Okay. Let's see. You say you had some criticisms of Rothbard. I remember in one of your live streams, you disagreed with Rothbard concerning the Jewish state of Israel. I know Rothbard was rather critical of Israel. Um, you want to explain your disagreement there?
Yes, actually, I have a forthcoming book on that, and I have a long law review article of about 150 pages, where we go over what Murray said. Me and my co-authors, Rafi and Alan Fuderman, and see what Murray is. Murray goes back to about 1870, and he says, "Look, the Arabs were there. The Arabs were in the contested areas. There were very few Jews, and therefore, the Jews are not justified in kicking the Arabs out, because the Arabs were there first. Whether Palestinians or other Arabs or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's Arab versus Jew." And if we only go back to the 1870s or the 1890s, I think Murray is correct. But what me and my co-authors do is we go back a little further, namely about 2,000 years further, and we say that the Jews were always there. They were there in the year 2000. The Romans kicked them out, but the property was justifiably the Jews. And therefore, if you go back 2,000 years, you have a very different attitude. So my co-authors and I agree with Murray and John Locke in terms of how do you justify property rights based on homesteading. It's just that he only goes back 100 years or so, or 150 years, and we go back quite a bit more. Now, this whole thing about reparations, I'm a big fan of reparations. I believe we should have reparations, and I don't believe there should be any time limit on reparations. I don't believe that there should be any limit on how far back you can go. Look, if I'm wearing a watch which has got a picture of your grandfather on it, and it's got his initials in it, or even his full name on it, and you see my watch, you should be able to come to me and say, "Hey, Walter, you got my grandfather's watch." And my grandfather probably would have given it to his son, namely my father, and my father probably would have given it to me. So therefore, you should give it to me. And you would say to me, "You're not a criminal. You didn't steal it. Your grandfather stole it from my grandfather, but you're not a criminal. Just give me the watch." And the law would say, "Well, this is statute of limitations, and the statute of limitations run out, and whatever it is, 50 years, 75 years, and let's say it's your great grandfather and my great grandfather, and the statute of limitations is run out." And I say statute of limitations is incompatible with libertarianism. You should get that watch. Now, it's not just that you should get the watch, but suppose now let's talk about black slavery. In 1865, the war ended, and what should have happened was that we should have had an ex post facto law. We should have said, "Look, slavery is wrong, and I don't care that slavery was legal in Alabama. It's wrong, and you slave owners, we're putting you in jail for the crime of kidnapping." I mean, all slavery is long-term kidnapping, and you kidnapped a bunch of slaves. You kidnapped 500 slaves. They were your slaves on your plantation in Alabama. And not only are we going to put you in jail, but we're going to take all your property and we're going to divide it among them, because they did all the work on the farm. You just hired a few overseers to whip the slaves, but you don't really deserve that 10,000 acre plantation. Rather, we're going to divide it up among the 500 slaves, and they'll all get 40 acres and a mule or something like that. That's what should have happened. But it didn't happen. What happened was that the blacks were free, thank God, but then the white kept that plantation. And he handed it to his son, who handed it to his son, who handed it to his son. And now there's some guy in Alabama, a white guy, who's the great grandson of the slave owner, and he's sitting there on his plantation of 10,000 acres or whatever it is. And now there's some guy in Harlem, a black guy in Harlem, and he comes along to a libertarian court and he says, "Hey, my grandfather was great grandfather, whatever, was a slave there, and I want 1/500th of the plantation." Well, possession is 9/10 of the law. The burden of proof is on he who wants to change things, sort of like what we had with this latest thing with Brett Kavanaugh when this woman accused him of something. The burden of proof is on her to prove something, not on his proof. The burden doesn't rest with him to prove something didn't happen. It's really hard to prove something didn't happen. So the burden of proof is on the black guy in Harlem who now wants to claim some land. And if he can prove it, fine. And if not, then too bad on him. So there is a natural statute of limitations, namely the farther back you go in history, the harder it is to prove anything because there wasn't a written language and people forget and things get lost in the winds of time. But now getting back to the Israeli case, there was a written language. There is evidence. And what my co-authors and I are trying to do is say, look, the Jews were there before the Palestinians. It was sort of like South Africa. The people in South Africa, first people in South Africa were whites. There were no blacks in South Africa when the whites came. The whites came and they had a very good economy. And then the blacks came from the neighboring countries to work for them. It was very similar with Palestine and Israel. There were no Arabs there. There was Jews. Well, there were very few Arabs, but it was mainly Jews. And the Arabs came to get jobs because the Jews had a good economy. So where I disagree with Murray on this, and let me just re-emphasize that I revere Murray. I think he is the best libertarian ever, who ever graced this planet, and the second best economist. But, we disagree on this. And, I told Murray about this, and he was friendly with me to the end of his life. And I disagree with him on voluntary slavery and on a whole bunch of other things. But that's one of them. So this is my explanation of where I diverge from Murray on the Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli question.
Okay. Someone asking in the chat that do you accept the Lockean proviso?
No, I accept the Lockean homesteading theory, but not the Lockean proviso. The Lockean homesteading theory, which Murray and Hans Hoppe have done more to support than pretty much any other two people, is that the way you get to own land is you mix your labor with it. You put in a crop, you clear some trees, you get rid of some rocks, you put in some corn plants, and now you own the corn. And not only do you own the corn, but you own the land. We're not Georges here who think you can't own land. But the Lockean proviso was this only applies while there's a lot of good enough and extra land. Once the land is pretty much taken up, then all of a sudden the Lockean theory doesn't apply. The Lockean proviso says it only applies when there's plenty of empty land. And what Murray and Hans and I would say is, no, it applies all the way. It applies until all the land is taken up. My motto is privatize everything. If it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. Well, suppose we've privatized 95% of the land or 98% of the land. Locke would then say, well, you can't privatize the rest of it. That's the Lockean proviso. Rothbard, Hoppe, and I would say, keep going, keep privatizing until it's all privatized. We shouldn't have any government land, and we shouldn't have any unowned land unless it's submarginal and nobody wants it. So that's the Lockean proviso, and I disagree with that. There was this friend of mine, another eminent libertarian theorist, Stefan Kinsella, who was kind enough to call something the Blockian, not the Lockean, but the Blockian proviso. And what I was saying is that if you homestead land in the form of a bagel, namely leaving a hole in the middle, which is unowned, I would say you can't do that. That's the Blockian proviso. Why can't you do that? Because then you would be controlling the square mile on the inside of the bagel or the donut, even though you didn't homestead it. So I would say you can't do that, and that's the Blockian proviso.
Okay. One more question from the chat. I'm assuming you heard of Steve Horowitz and George Selgin, the Austrian, the frame baker, right?
I've heard of Steve Horowitz and George Selgin. And what was the rest of the point that you just made?
Um, they both defend fractional reserve banking, and they say it's non-fraudulent. What's your view on the Rothbardian case of fractional reserve banking being fraudulent?
Yes, I agree with Murray, and I agree with look. I agree with Murray on 99.9% of everything. Just a few things we disagree, and I certainly agree with Murray on fractional reserve banking. Look, I now deposit $100 in your bank, and you're a fractional reserve banker. So what you do is you give me a checking deposit for how much? For 100. I can write a check up to 100. And then what you do is you take 90 of my money that I just deposited with you, and you lend it to George Selgin. And what do you do with George Selgin? Well, you're a fraction reserve banker, and your fraction is 10%, and you now have uh, you keep $10 toward my 100, namely you're a 10% fractional reserve banker. So you lend him $90, and you give him a checkbook for $90, and he can come in any time and get his 90, and I can come any time and get my 100. And how much do you have? You have a stinking lousy $10. And what you're hoping is that we both don't come into the bank at the same time. Well, there used to be $100 in the system, and now there's 190. And what you then do is you take that 90 from him, and you keep $9, and you lend out another 80, 81, I guess it would be. And eventually, with a fraction of 10%, there's going to be $1,000 in the banking system. And the point is that there's going to be titles to $1,000, and there's only going to be $100. Namely, you're creating money out of the thin air. Look, right now I'm in, what city are you in?
Raleigh.
Raleigh, North Carolina?
Yes.
Okay, you're in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I don't know how many cars there are in Raleigh, North Carolina. Let's say there's 100,000 cars. How many titles to cars are there? Well, there better be only 100,000, not any more, not any less. Suppose I started printing up extra titles to cars. Well, that's that's a little fraudulent. And yet that's exactly what the fractional reserve banking system does. It creates more titles to property than this property. And when there was this wonderful movie, Zero Mostel, a Mel Brooks movie, The Producers, where Zero Mostel was going around to little old ladies and selling them shares in the play. I think the play was Springtime for Hitler. Did you ever see that movie?
No.
You must see that movie. I order you to see that movie. You will die laughing. Hopefully, you won't die, but it's just a wonderful movie. Everyone should see that movie. And he goes, Zero Mostel, the hero or the main character, goes around these little old ladies, and he starts selling them. You have a half a share in this play, and you have 3/4 of a share, and you have 2/3 of a share. And he's selling, 10,000% of the play, but there's only 100% of the play. And he's blithely selling shares, and he hopes that the play will fail so he won't get caught. But the play works out well, and then he gets into trouble. The point is, it's illicit to have more titles to property than there is property, because then we have an overdetermination. So I think George Selgin and Larry White and Steve Horowitz are wrong on this. And then the question comes, well, suppose I impugn the veracity of your bank. I say you're a bum. You have only 10%, and then what happens is there's going to be a run on your bank. And I think I'm not sure what George and Larry and Steve's position on runs on banks, but as far as I'm concerned, that's just gossip, and it should be legal, and yet it's illegal. Well, nowadays, what we have is we have a Fed and we have central banking. So if we foment a run on the bank, the Fed will just print up more money and save your rear end. Because remember, you only have $100 and you owe 1,000, or you have your clients have rights to $1,000 and all you've got is 100. Or in the first iteration, you had 10 and the money outstanding against you was 190. So yes, I think fractional reserve banking is a fraud, and people that do it should be put in jail.
Okay. On Hans Hoppe, the infamous physical remove guy. Just do you have any opinion about this? About him being a connection to more extremist politics. Um, in particularly the alt right. People often use him as an inspiration in his particular text, "Democracy: The God That Failed." Do you have any commentary on that?
Yeah, I think Hans is one of the most creative, brilliant libertarian theoreticians, not only practicing now, but ever practicing. I think he's way better than Robert Nozick, who is much more famous. I think he's brilliant. He's magnificent. And that book, The God That Failed, The Government, The God That Failed, something like that, I forget the exact title, is a magnificent book. I disagree with one or two lines in it, but I think it's a wonderful book. Now, look, if a bunch of Nazis read the book and get inspired, that's not Hans's fault. I've had that experience too. People read my books, not only defending, but many of my books, and some of them are Nazis, some of them are commies. I can't help that. Hans can't help that. But that's the risk that anyone who publishes anything. Look, right now we're having an interview. There might be somebody who reads your question and sees your question or hears your question and goes out and commits a crime. Is that your fault? No. I mean, you just asked innocent questions, brilliant questions, but innocent questions. Look, the Bible is full of begetting and beheadings and killings and this and that and the other. Suppose some misguided person reads the Bible and then goes out and commits a crime. Is that the Bible's fault? No. So it's not Hans's fault. I think I'm a big, big fan of Hans Hoppe, and I think that book is a magnificent book.
Okay. Let's see. You have you any thoughts on this criticism of the alternative right when he gave his speech last year?
I promised you an hour, and we're now coming up on the hour. So let this be the last question.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. The alt right is, as our president Donald Trump says, they have some good people and some bad people. Some of the people there are very, very bad, and some of the people there are very, very good. The alt right is a reaction to feminism and multiculturalism and Black studies and queer studies and feminist studies and all of that stuff. And to that extent, they're the good guys. On the other hand, they're not the good guys because they believe in violating people's rights. So my attitude toward them is some good and some bad.
Okay.
Let me just say in closing that I really enjoyed this interview. I think you asked really, really good questions. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to be on your show again if you'd like.
Thank you, Dr. Black, for coming on, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the week.
Thanks
Wakanda
again.
forever.
Thanks again for having me on your show. Take care.